Upon seeing the title of this work by Aristotle, you might think you have an idea concerning what the book is going to be about. The physics. Well, we all know what physics is. You might think then that this book is going to be about gravity and atoms and nuclear reactions and electromagnetism, whatever else, right? You might think it's going to be about physics in our sense, but you read just the first paragraph and it's very clear that it's not. And so, why is it called this? Where is it getting this name from? That's going to be our way into discussing what the project of the physics is, what Aristotle is trying to do in this book. So the word in Greek that is translated as physics here, the title of Aristotle's book here, comes from the Greek word physis. It's where we get our word physics and physical and everything like that. Comes from this Greek word physis. That word, however, just means nature. That's the word for nature. And so when they wanted to say that something was contrary to nature, they would say paraphysis. Physis was their word for nature. The nature of a thing is the physis of a thing. And so Aristotle's project here is not to talk about gravity necessarily, it's to talk about nature. The physics, Aristotle's physics, is a study of nature. And what he means by nature is also, we're going to see this as we proceed. This is going to be an explicit question, a question that he explicitly addresses. What exactly does he mean by nature? But here at the outset, to give us a little bit of, to give us our bearing so we have some idea of what's going on. He doesn't really mean by nature what we mean by nature. What's going to become clear is that by the study of nature, what Aristotle is getting at when he's talking about the study of nature is the study of sensible reality, the structure of sensible reality, of reality as we experience it, the things that we interact with via the senses. What is the fundamental structure of those things? How is reality fundamentally structured? That's what Aristotle is getting at in the physics. Now, this is going to contrast with Plato. This is going to be one area in which Aristotle departs company from Plato departs from Plato. If you recall, Plato thought that we couldn't really have knowledge or understanding of the sensible world, of the stuff that we interact with using our senses. It's not stable. It isn't being. It isn't, strictly speaking. It's other than what it is. All this other kind of stuff. And so when we have knowledge, we're really having knowledge of forms or something like that. Aristotle, by contrast, is much more amenable to, in some sense or other, knowledge of the sensible world here around us. We're going to see the ways in which he's still kind of indebted to Plato and still ultimately Platonic. But by and large, Aristotle thinks that we can investigate the natural world, the world presented to us through the senses, and come to understand it and understand how it works. This contrast between Plato and Aristotle, right? Plato thinking you can only really understand these forms, whereas Aristotle is advocating for more empirical investigation of the natural world, the sensible world. This contrast is one of the main ways that people try to think about the difference between Plato and Aristotle. And this is none more evident than in the famous painting by Raphael titled The School of Athens. You've likely seen this painting. It's in it's in the Vatican. Back in the day, it was the Pope's bedroom, I believe. This was painted on his wall. At the center of the painting, you see two figures there. Those two figures are Plato and Aristotle. Plato, incidentally, you've probably heard this, but if you haven't, his face is actually the face of Leonardo da Vinci. It's a portrait of Leonardo da Vinci. But anyways, you have Plato and Aristotle talking there at the center, right? At the very center of the composition, everything is kind of directed at them. If you look at the perspective, everything flows around them. Now look at their hands and look at what they're doing. Plato is pointing up, whereas Aristotle, and looks like he's kind of disagreeing. He's kind of putting his hand, gesturing towards the earth or down here. Raphael is trying to capture this contrast that I was just talking about between Plato and Aristotle. Plato thinking that all we can really do is try to commune with the forms. That's what knowledge is of. The forms. He's pointing up at the forms, even though the forms aren't in space or whatever, right? But pointing up to the heavens, the realm of the form, something like that. Whereas Aristotle is saying, no. We can investigate and know the things down here, right? And so we have these differing gestures, this disagreement. And so what we're going to be seeing in Aristotle is the grounds for someone like Aristotle or someone like Raphael saying that there's this kind of opposition or this disagreement between Plato and Aristotle. Now, for what it's worth, I think this disagreement often gets overstated, and we'll see that as we proceed. But Aristotle investigating the natural world, whereas Plato thought you should just use your mind to think about these forms. Now, for what it's worth, there's a bunch of people in this painting, as you can see. Somebody we know, Socrates, is standing right over there. There's about 1 million other people, and people don't know exactly who everybody is, but there are pretty good guesses here. Interesting fact: Heraclitus down there at the bottom. That's a portrait of Michelangelo, and lo and behold, over there in the corner, Raphael just paints himself, right? Okay. So Aristotle's project contrasts with Plato. The way he describes his project. So in the very general sense, it's going to be a study of nature. Okay, fine. Well, what exactly are we going to do? We're going to try to find the principles of nature. Think of this as like the most fundamental starting points, most fundamental elements, the principles of nature. And his idea is that the reason that we're going to search for these principles of nature is because it's only by understanding those that we can come to have knowledge of a thing, of a field, of a subject. Right? So think of it, and this is kind of the way Aristotle is thinking about it. Think of it as in terms of geometry. Geometry, at least the way that Euclid presented geometry, starts with certain axioms, definitions of a line, a definition of a triangle, and so on. These certain basic axiomatic truths, these certain principles. And it's only by understanding those axioms, those basic truths, those principles, that you can then go on to understand everything else about geometry. The rest of Euclid's geometry is derived from those 5 axioms, right? If you're familiar with Euclid, there are 5 of these axioms. And then everything else in geometry, every other truth in geometry can be derived from those 5. And so to really understand geometry, you need to grasp those 5 axioms. You need to understand them. And then you can go do the rest of what you're doing. Aristotle has a similar idea when it comes to any kind of scientific investigation. You need to grasp the basic truths of the subject under discussion in order to understand that subject. And so when it comes to the study of nature, what Aristotle's going to want to do, what he's trying to do in the physics, in the first place at least, is to find what the principles of nature are. What are these kind of axiomatic basic items from which we can understand the entirety and the rest of nature, right? The principles of nature, the basic, most fundamental realities of nature. Think of it this way. He's looking for what the fundamental constituents or structure of nature is. And we today might say things like, we start thinking, I don't know, like particles, like, or quarks or something like that, right? And maybe like forces, quarks, and four, or I don't know, I think there are four fundamental forces, four or five. I can't remember what it is. I think it's four. Those would be maybe the principles of nature. Aristotle's going to say, no, that doesn't go far enough, as we're going to see. Those things are really just more like matter or something, which might be one principle of nature, but we need to push the investigation further. That doesn't fully exhaust the structure of sensible reality. And so we're going to see now what Aristotle thinks of as the principles of nature.